My boyfriend Ethan had been acting strangely for weeks. Then one night, while we were watching TV, he asked me a question that made me turn off the television entirely. We were half watching some forgettable Friday night show, his arm around me the way it always was, when he went quiet for a long moment and then said, carefully, like he'd been rehearsing it in his head for days, "If I couldn't be with you anymore, would you stay with my brother?" I laughed at first, assuming it was some strange, roundabout joke. Ethan didn't laugh with me. "I'm serious," he said, his eyes fixed on the blank space where the screen had just been, refusing to meet mine directly. "Ryan cares about you. He'd take care of you. I need to know you'd be okay." "Ethan," I said slowly, my stomach twisting into something cold and unfamiliar. "What is this actually about?" He'd been distant for 3 weeks by then, canceling plans, disappearing for hours without explanation, flinching whenever I touched his arm in a particular spot near his collarbone. I'd assumed, in my worst moments, that he was preparing to leave me. I'd assumed, in my better moments, that work stress had simply gotten to him. I hadn't assumed this. Whatever this was. "Nothing," he said, too quickly, standing abruptly and heading toward the kitchen, the same evasive pattern I'd watched him repeat for weeks now. Forget I said anything. I didn't forget. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to, because something in the careful, rehearsed way he'd asked that question told me, with sudden and total clarity, that Ethan wasn't preparing to leave me for someone else. He was preparing me for something he hadn't found the courage to say out loud yet, and I intended to find out exactly what that was, whatever it cost either of us to finally say it. I found Ethan in the kitchen 10 minutes later, standing at the counter with a glass of water he wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular. "I'm not going to forget you said that," I told him, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "I need you to actually talk to me, Ethan. Something's been wrong for weeks." He set the glass down carefully, his hands not quite steady. "I've had some appointments," he said finally. "Medical ones. I wasn't ready to tell you about them yet." My chest tightened immediately. "What kind of appointments?" "I started having headaches about 2 months ago," he said. "Bad ones. Worse than migraines. I went in for an MRI 3 weeks ago, purely to rule things out, and they found something they wanted to investigate further." "Ethan." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I don't have all the answers yet," he said quickly, apparently reading the panic building in my expression. "I have a follow-up next week with a specialist. I didn't want to tell you until I actually knew something concrete, because I didn't want to scare you over what might turn out to be nothing." "And the question about Ryan," I said slowly. "That wasn't nothing." Ethan's jaw tightened, something raw and frightened passing behind his eyes that I'd never once seen from him in the 4 years we'd been together. "I've been thinking about worst-case scenarios," he admitted. "More than I should be, probably, before I even have real answers. I know that's not fair to either of us." "You don't get to plan my future with your brother," I said, my voice shaking now, "before you've even told me what's actually happening to you." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." I think I panicked, imagining futures I have no business imagining yet, and somewhere in that panic, I latched onto the idea that if something happened to me, at least I'd know you weren't completely alone. I crossed the kitchen and pulled him into my arms, feeling him finally, fully deflate against me, 3 weeks of carried fear releasing all at once. "Whatever this is," I said, "we're facing it together. Not you deciding my future alone in some hospital waiting room, and definitely not by handing me off to your brother, like I'm something that needs a backup plan." "Okay," Ethan said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "Together." I should have said that from the beginning. I held him a moment longer, understanding that whatever answers next week's specialist appointment held, our lives had already, quietly, permanently shifted the moment he'd asked that impossible question over a paused television show. The specialist appointment landed on a gray Tuesday morning, and I insisted on going with him, refusing to let him carry this alone any longer than he already had. Dr. Palmer, a careful, soft-spoken urologist, reviewed Ethan's scans with an expression that gave away nothing until she finally set the images down and looked at both of us directly. "The mass is located in a treatable area," she said. "I want to be clear about that first, because I know this conversation is frightening regardless of what I say next. We're looking at a low-grade glioma. Slow-growing, which works in our favor. Surgery is the recommended first step, followed by monitoring. Slow-growing, Ethan repeated slowly. So this isn't. It's serious, Dr. Palmer said carefully. I won't minimize that. But it's also considerably more manageable than the more aggressive alternatives we were ruling out. With surgery and proper follow-up care, patients with this specific profile often do quite well long-term. I felt something in my chest that had been clenched for 3 weeks finally, slightly loosen, though the word surgery still carried a weight neither of us was fully prepared to process yet. What does surgery actually involve? Ethan asked. A craniotomy, Dr. Palmer said. Considerable recovery time, several weeks minimum, with physical and possibly speech therapy, depending on the exact location once we're operating, and can assess more precisely. I won't pretend this is a small procedure. But it's the right first step, and your prognosis with treatment is considerably better than what I suspect you've been imagining these past few weeks. We left that appointment with a surgery date 3 weeks out, a folder full of information neither of us had fully absorbed yet, and a version of fear that had shifted, slightly, into something with an actual shape instead of formless dread. I should have told you the moment I got that first scan, Ethan said, sitting in the parking garage, neither of us quite ready to drive yet. I spent 3 weeks imagining the worst possible version of this, and somehow decided the kindest thing was preparing you for a future without me, rather than just letting you be scared alongside me. That wasn't kind, I said gently. It was lonely. For both of us. I know that now, he said. I think I panic by trying to control things I can't actually control. Planning your future with Ryan felt, somehow, like doing something useful with fear I didn't know what else to do with. I reached for his hand, lacing our fingers together the way we had 1,000 times before, though this time it felt considerably more deliberate. Next time you're scared, I said, tell me. Immediately. I don't need you to have a plan. I just need you to not disappear into your own head while I'm sitting right next to you, wondering what I did wrong. Deal, Ethan said quietly. I'm sorry it took a paused television show and a fairly alarming question about my brother to finally say any of this out loud. Ryan came over that weekend, ostensibly to help Ethan sort through insurance paperwork, though I suspected the visit had considerably more to do with checking on both of us directly. I owe you an apology, I told him, once Ethan had stepped out to take a call from the hospital's scheduling office. Ethan told me what he asked me, about staying with you, if things went badly. Ryan's ears went visibly red, the family resemblance between the brothers suddenly, comically obvious. He told you that? He did. I'm going to kill him, Ryan muttered, though the affection underneath the embarrassment was unmistakable. Nadia, I promise you, I had absolutely no idea he was planning to say something like that. That's not. I care about both of you. As family. That's the entire extent of it. I believe you, I said, and I did, watching him carefully. I think Ethan panicked and reached for the person he trusted most to take care of me, without fully thinking through how strange that would actually sound out loud. That does sound like him, Ryan admitted, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. He's always been like this. Terrible at expressing fear directly, excellent at building elaborate contingency plans nobody asked for instead. We spent the rest of that afternoon together, the three of us, working through insurance paperwork and pre-surgical checklists with a kind of grim, determined teamwork that felt, despite everything, considerably better than the isolated fear of the previous 3 weeks. How are you actually doing? Ryan asked me quietly, catching me alone in the kitchen while Ethan reviewed paperwork in the other room. Really? Not the version you're telling him, to keep him calm. I considered the question honestly, grateful for someone finally asking it directly. Terrified, I admitted. Trying not to let him see how terrified, because he's carrying enough fear of his own right now. You don't have to perform calm for either of us, Ryan said gently. I'm scared too. He's my brother. I've known him my entire life, and the idea of surgery of any of this, he stopped, collecting himself. I just mean you're allowed to be scared, Nadia. Loudly, if you need to be. Nobody in this family is going to think less of you for it. I felt tears gathering unexpectedly. The accumulated weight of 3 weeks of careful, controlled composure finally cracking slightly in front of someone who wasn't asking me to be strong for his benefit. Thank you, I said, for saying that, and for genuinely never once being the person Ethan apparently imagined handing me off to. Least weird thing my brothers ever asked of me, Ryan said dryly, and that's including the time he asked me to help him practice a marriage proposal on a mannequin. I laughed properly for the first time in weeks, the sound surprising even me, grateful, in that strange, difficult moment, for a family that apparently faced fear with exactly the right blend of honesty and absurdity. Surgery day arrived faster than any of us felt prepared for, gray morning light filling the hospital waiting room where Ryan and I sat together, both of us pretending to read magazines neither of us actually absorbed a single word of. 6 hours, Ryan said, checking his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. Dr. Palmer said the procedure typically runs 4 to 6 hours, depending on what they find once they're actually in there. I know, I said. You've told me twice already. Sorry, he said. I count things when I'm nervous. Minutes, mostly. It's a terrible coping mechanism. It's not terrible, I said. It's honest. I've just been staring at the same paragraph of this magazine for 20 minutes, so I'm not exactly winning at coping either. We sat together through those 6 hours, occasionally talking, mostly simply existing in shared, anxious silence, Ryan's steady presence considerably more comforting than I'd expected it to be, given how strange our introduction to this particular ordeal had been. Dr. Palmer finally emerged just past the 5-hour mark, her surgical cap still on, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals train themselves to maintain until they're ready to deliver actual information. The surgery went well, she said, and I felt my knees nearly give out with relief. We were able to remove the majority of the mass. He's in recovery now, stable, and we'll know more about long-term prognosis once pathology results come back on the tissue we removed, typically within a week to 10 days. Can we see him? I asked. Once he's settled in recovery briefly, Dr. Palmer said. He'll be groggy, possibly disoriented for a few hours. That's entirely normal. Ryan squeezed my hand before I even registered he'd reached for it, both of us apparently needing the same small anchor of physical reassurance after 6 hours of uncertainty. We found Ethan an hour later, pale and groggy against white hospital sheets, his head partially bandaged, looking simultaneously fragile and, somehow, still recognizably himself. Hey, he murmured, his eyes finding mine slowly, focus swimming in and out. Did it work? They think so, I said, taking his hand carefully, mindful of the foreline. We're waiting on more details. But you're here. You made it through. Ryan, Ethan said, his groggy gaze shifting slightly. Did you take care of her? While I was under. Somebody had to, Ryan said, his voice rough with emotion despite the light tone. Turns out I'm considerably better at waiting rooms than emergency contingency planning, big brother. Ethan managed a weak, exhausted smile, already drifting back toward sleep, and I stood there between the two of them, understanding, watching this strange, devoted, slightly ridiculous family navigate crisis together, exactly why Ethan had reached for Ryan's name in his fear, even if the specific ask had been entirely the wrong way to express it. Recovery came slowly, measured in small victories that felt enormous at the time. The first day Ethan managed to walk unassisted down the hospital corridor. The first afternoon he stayed awake long enough for an entire conversation. The first joke he made that actually sounded like him again rather than a groggy imitation. I moved into his apartment properly during those weeks, technically already living there most nights before the surgery, though now it felt considerably more permanent. My presence woven into his daily recovery routine in ways that felt less like caretaking and more like simply, finally, fully sharing a life. Ryan visited constantly, occasionally overstepping the careful boundaries of a supportive brother, showing up unannounced with meal-prepped dinners we hadn't asked for, or offering unsolicited medical opinions gathered from what he insisted was extremely reliable internet research. You're not a doctor, Ethan told him, exasperated but visibly fond, during one particularly enthusiastic explanation of neural pathway regeneration. I'm an extremely dedicated brother with excellent search engine skills, Ryan said. That's basically the same thing. The pathology results arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after surgery, Dr. Palmer's office calling to schedule an in-person follow-up rather than delivering news over the phone, a detail that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through both of us despite 2 weeks of steadily improving optimism. That's not necessarily bad, I told Ethan, though my own voice wavered slightly. Sometimes they just prefer discussing results in person. Sometimes, Ethan agreed, though neither of us fully believed the reassurance. We sat in Dr. Palmer's office 2 days later, Ryan insisting on joining us despite Ethan's initial protest that he didn't need to take more time off work. The pathology results show the tumor was slightly more aggressive than the initial imaging suggested, Dr. Palmer said carefully, watching our faces as she delivered the news. Grade 2, rather than the grade 1 we'd initially hoped for. This means we'll be recommending a course of radiation therapy following your recovery to address any remaining microscopic cells the surgery couldn't fully capture. The room felt suddenly considerably smaller. What does that change? Ethan asked, his voice carefully controlled. In terms of prognosis. It changes the treatment plan, Dr. Palmer said. It doesn't necessarily change your long-term outlook as dramatically as you might fear. Grade 2 gliomas, with proper follow-up treatment, still carry a considerably favorable prognosis for many patients. I want to be honest with you both, without either minimizing or catastrophizing what this diagnosis means. I reached for Ethan's hand, feeling it tremble slightly beneath mine, understanding that whatever fragile relief we'd built over the past 2 weeks had just shifted into something considerably more uncertain again. Radiation, Ethan said slowly. For how long? Typically 6 weeks, Dr. Palmer said. Daily sessions, Monday through Friday. We'll monitor closely throughout. Ryan spoke up from the corner of the room, his voice steady despite the visible worry in his expression. Whatever you need, he said. Rides to appointments, meal prep, someone to sit with you during treatment. Both of you. I'm not going anywhere. I looked between the two brothers and felt, despite the frightening new information, genuinely, unexpectedly grateful for the family currently rallying around us both. Radiation started 3 weeks later, once Ethan's surgical recovery had progressed enough for his oncology team to clear him for the next phase of treatment. The routine settled into something exhausting but manageable. Daily appointments squeezed around work schedules, Ryan taking the Wednesday shift every week without fail, me handling the rest, both of us trading off with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who'd learned, quickly, that surviving something like this required actual logistics rather than simply good intentions. Ethan grew tired in ways that frightened me during those 6 weeks, the radiation's cumulative effect wearing him down steadily despite his attempts to push through it with his usual stubborn humor. I feel like I've aged 40 years in 6 weeks, he told me one evening, barely managing to stay awake through dinner. Is this what being 90 feels like? Because if so, I have several complaints. You're allowed to be tired, I said. You don't have to perform being fine for my benefit. I know, he said. I'm working on that. Slowly. The fear resurfaced unexpectedly one evening during week 4, both of us lying in bed unable to sleep, Ethan finally breaking a long silence with something raw and unguarded. I keep thinking about that question I asked you, he admitted quietly. About Ryan. I think I need to actually explain why properly, instead of just apologizing for it. Okay, I said, turning to face him in the dark. My father died young, Ethan said. I've never told you the details because it's not something I like discussing. He had a brain tumor too, diagnosed when I was 19, gone within 8 months. I watched my mother fall apart afterward, completely alone, because most of their friends had drifted away during the illness and never quite came back after. I felt my chest tighten, understanding, finally, the full weight behind his panicked, poorly worded question. When I got that diagnosis, Ethan continued, some part of me went straight back to being 19, watching my mother's isolation, terrified of putting you through the same thing. I think I convinced myself, in the middle of that panic, that securing your future with someone I trusted was somehow protecting you from becoming her. Ethan, I said softly, reaching for his hand in the dark. I'm not your mother, and you're not your father, statistically or otherwise. Dr. Palmer's been clear about that from the beginning. I know, he said. Logically, I know that. Fear doesn't always listen to logic, though. No, I agreed. But you don't have to face that fear alone anymore. That's the entire point of me being here. Not as some contingency plan you're trying to arrange in advance, but as the person who's actually staying through whatever this turns out to be. Ethan pulled me closer, his breathing finally evening out towards sleep, and I lay awake a while longer, understanding considerably more now about the fear that had driven 3 strange, difficult weeks and grateful, despite everything, that he'd finally found the words to explain it properly. Ryan and I talked more openly after that, both of us understanding, finally, the fuller context behind Ethan's strange question, though the conversation shifted somewhat once I mentioned it to him directly during a quiet Wednesday drive to Ethan's radiation appointment. He told you about Dad, Ryan said, his voice carrying old, familiar grief. That explains a lot, actually. I was 17 when Dad died. Ethan tried so hard to hold everything together afterward for Mom, for me, that I don't think he ever properly processed his own fear about it.
He's processing it now, I said. Slowly.
Badly sometimes. But he's trying. That's more than he managed the first time around, Ryan said. I was too young to really help him then. I'm considerably more useful now, apparently, even if my usefulness mostly involves questionable internet research and overly aggressive meal prepping. We fell into an easier rhythm after that conversation, the strange tension from Ethan's original question finally, fully dissolving into something closer to genuine, uncomplicated family closeness. Ethan's final radiation session arrived on an unseasonably warm Friday afternoon, 6 weeks of daily treatment finally, exhaustingly complete. Ryan and I both took the afternoon off work to be there, waiting in the same hospital lobby where we'd once counted anxious minutes during his surgery. You survived it, I told him, when he finally emerged from the treatment room, visibly drained but managing a genuine smile. Barely, he said. Though I've developed a considerable appreciation for hospital parking garage architecture, having stared at the same one for 6 weeks straight. Very niche expertise, Ryan said. Truly a marketable skill. We celebrated that evening with a quiet dinner at home, nothing elaborate, simply the three of us, plus, eventually, Ethan's mother, who arrived with a homemade cake and considerably more tears than any of us had prepared for. I'm so proud of you, she told Ethan, holding his face in both hands the way mothers do when words feel insufficient for the moment. All three of you, actually. I don't think I could have gotten through watching this happen twice without knowing you had each other. I looked around that small kitchen. Ethan, considerably thinner and more tired than 6 weeks ago, but unmistakably, stubbornly himself. Ryan cutting cake with more enthusiasm than technical skill, their mother wiping happy tears with a dish towel, and felt, despite everything this family had survived, genuinely, deeply grateful to have become part of it. Scan results in 3 months, Ethan said quietly, once his mother had gone home and Ryan had headed out shortly after. That's the next milestone. Making sure the radiation actually worked. 3 months, I said. We can handle 3 months. Together, this time. No secret contingency plans required. Deal, Ethan said, pulling me close. I promise. From now on, whatever I'm afraid of, you hear about it directly, however badly I managed to phrase it. The 3 months leading up to scan results tested every ounce of patience either of us possessed, ordinary life resuming its normal rhythm while an unspoken countdown hummed quietly beneath everything we did. Ethan returned to work gradually, his energy slowly rebuilding, though I noticed him occasionally pausing mid-conversation, his hand drifting briefly toward his temple, and I understood, watching those small moments, that some fear simply doesn't fully leave once it's taken up residence. I keep waiting to feel normal again, he admitted one evening, both of us cooking dinner together, an ordinary domestic scene that felt, after everything, considerably more precious than it once had. Like I'm supposed to just snap back into who I was before any of this happened. Maybe that person doesn't come back exactly the same, I said carefully. Maybe you just become a slightly different version, who's survived something enormous and gets to decide what that actually means going forward. That's either very wise, Ethan said, or something you read on an inspirational coffee mug. Possibly both, I said, laughing despite the weight of the conversation. Ryan proposed, unprompted, that the three of us establish a standing Sunday dinner tradition, a suggestion that started as practical scan anxiety management and gradually became something we all genuinely looked forward to, regardless of what results loomed ahead. It's good for Mom too, Ryan pointed out, during one such dinner. Gives her somewhere regular to see both of us, rather than just anxious phone calls whenever she's worried. When are you not worried, Mom? Ethan asked, earning a pointed look from their mother that suggested he'd stepped directly into a well-deserved correction. I raised 2 sons through considerable chaos, she said. Worry is simply my primary language at this point. I'm fluent. The scan finally happened on a Tuesday morning, Ryan and I both accompanying Ethan again, the familiar hospital corridors no longer quite as frightening as they'd once been, though the anxiety of waiting for results hadn't lessened in the slightest. Dr. Palmer called us into her office 2 days later, her expression, for the first time in this entire ordeal, carrying something unmistakably close to genuine relief. "The scan shows no evidence of remaining tumor tissue," she said. "The radiation appears to have successfully addressed what the surgery couldn't fully capture. I want to be clear that we'll continue monitoring with regular scans going forward, standard protocol for this type of diagnosis, but this is an excellent result, Ethan. Genuinely excellent." I felt tears spill over before I'd fully processed the words, Ryan's hand finding my shoulder, Ethan sitting very still for a long moment before something in his posture finally, completely relaxed. "No evidence of tumor," he repeated slowly, as though testing whether the words would hold up under his own scrutiny. "No evidence," Dr. Palmer confirmed. "We'll take this one scan at a time going forward. But today, this is genuinely good news." 6 months after that first clean scan, life had settled into something that finally felt, again, like an ordinary future rather than a series of anxious milestones counted in weeks and appointments. Ethan's energy had fully returned by then, his humor sharper than ever, though he developed a new habit I noticed and quietly treasured, actually voicing his fears out loud, however small, rather than disappearing into silent, solitary contingency planning. "I'm nervous about the presentation tomorrow," he told me one evening, entirely unprompted over dinner. "Work stuff. Nothing medical. I just wanted you to know, since apparently I'm practicing saying things out loud now instead of just internally spiraling." "I appreciate the practice," I said, smiling. "Considerably less alarming than last time you decided to voice an internal spiral." "I will genuinely never live down the brother question," Ethan said, groaning. "Ryan brings it up at literally every family gathering now." "As he should," I said. "It's excellent material." Ryan, for his part, had leaned fully into the ongoing joke, occasionally introducing himself at gatherings as Ethan's brother, official emergency contingency plan, which never failed to make Ethan visibly cringe and their mother laugh until she needed to sit down. Sunday dinners continued, a permanent fixture now rather than an anxiety-driven tradition, the 4 of us, Ethan, Ryan, their mother, and me, settling into an easy rhythm that felt, increasingly, like the family I'd quietly always wanted without fully realizing how much I'd been missing it. "You know," Ethan said one Sunday evening, both of us washing dishes together while Ryan and his mother argued cheerfully over a card game in the other room, "I think that terrible, panicked question ended up being one of the most important things I ever said to you, even though I said it in the worst possible way." "How do you figure?" I asked. "Because it forced everything into the open faster than I would have managed on my own," he said. "If I just quietly kept spiraling without ever asking it, I don't think I'd have found my way to actually telling you about my father, about the fear underneath all of it. I think I needed to say something strange enough that you'd refuse to let it go." "I definitely refused to let it go," I said. Turning off the TV was a pretty clear signal. "Extremely clear," Ethan agreed. "Effective, if terrifying, communication strategy on my part." I dried the last dish and set it aside, looking at this man who'd frightened me badly with one poorly worded question and then, slowly, patiently, taught me considerably more about honest fear and honest love than I think either of us had fully understood before this entire ordeal began. "For the record," I said, "if you're ever tempted to plan my future with a family member again instead of just talking to me directly, I'd prefer you skip straight to the talking part." "Noted," Ethan said, laughing. "I'll be sure to lead with actual words next time, rather than elaborate contingency plans nobody asked for." 2 years after that first frightening question over a paused television show, Ethan proposed to me in our own kitchen, no elaborate staging, no rehearsed speech, just a simple ring, and a request delivered with the same directness he'd finally, painstakingly learned to practice. "I want to be clear this time about exactly what I'm asking," he said, kneeling slightly awkwardly against the kitchen island. "Not a contingency plan. Not a worst-case scenario I'm trying to manage in advance. Just, will you marry me? Directly. No brothers involved as backup options." I laughed through unexpected tears, pulling him up before he could finish the sentence properly. "Yes," I said. "Obviously yes. Though I do think Ryan deserves at least an honorary role in the wedding, given everything he's been through with us." "Best man," Ethan said immediately. "Already decided. He'll never let me forget it if I don't include him properly, given how much material I've handed him over the years." We married the following spring, A small ceremony in his mother's backyard. Ryan's best man speech somehow managing to reference the infamous brother question no fewer than 3 times, each mention landing with a particular warmth of a joke that had, over years, transformed from painful confusion into genuine family lore. To Ethan, Ryan said, raising his glass toward the end of his speech, who once asked his girlfriend an absolutely baffling question out of pure, terrified love, and somehow, against considerable odds, ended up marrying her anyway, having finally learned that talking directly to the person you love works considerably better than elaborate contingency planning. To talking directly, the gathered guests echoed, laughing, and I looked around that small backyard, Ethan beside me, considerably steadier now than the frightened man who'd once asked me that impossible question, Ryan grinning at having successfully embarrassed his brother one final, public time, their mother dabbing happy tears with a same dish towel she always seemed to have nearby for exactly this purpose. Ethan's scans remained clean, appointment after appointment, year after year. The particular fear that had once driven him toward that strange, panicked question gradually settling into something manageable rather than something that controlled him. Do you ever think about it? I asked him that evening, both of us finally alone after the wedding guests had gone home. That question. How different things might have gone if I'd reacted differently. Constantly, Ethan admitted. I think about how close I came to handling that entire diagnosis completely alone, convinced that protecting you meant planning around my own absence instead of just letting you in. I'm glad you didn't, I said. Even if the question itself was genuinely one of the strangest things anyone's ever said to me. In my defense, Ethan said, pulling me close, it worked eventually. Terribly roundabout, but eventually. If your partner asked you something that's strange and frightening out of nowhere, would you have turned off the television and demanded answers the way Nadia did, or given them space to figure out how to say it properly first? Tell me in the comments, and if this story moved you, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.